straddling a metronomically timed mule. A hardened young lad from the local traveller community was performing a traditional horse dance with effortless mastery, accompanied by both a drummer and a hornblower on foot, in the frenzied car park of Newmarket Race Course. Clapping along to the frantic rhythm of the music, the arriving spectators encircled the dancing horse in a great multitude, alive with excited movement. Rory and I were among them, as well as his old-school chum James, swaying and dancing together as we passed between ourselves a travel decanter of sherry and a continuous feed of cigarettes. All of the men in attendance were sweltering in their top hats and morning suits as they began to populate the tarmacked Bacchanalia on that punishingly hot July day. Apart from Mr. Stewart, who came wearing a Bedouin's robes, beaming white, with a cotton headscarf draped over his alabaster face. Now, it's worth mentioning that Rory and James had jointly invested in a racehorse together and named the stallion Zulu Dostoevsky. The two gentlemen had split a £500 bet on Zulu Dostoevsky to win at 33-1. As we all continued to marvel at the traveller boy astride his perfectly choreographed workhorse, James was cocksurely predicting a victory on the track for their young stud. And sniffing cocaine that he generously shared amongst our party of three, he adorned Zulu Dostoevsky with all manner of boasting praise. An upbeat sort of chap, who proved to be James's former mentor from his early days in the energy sector, came over to wish us luck in the race. James told him, as the three of us trotted back and forth with interlocking shoulders, that the gesture, though appreciated, was entirely unnecessary, for our horse ran like the wind and jumped like a grasshopper, and we were in no need of luck. "You might want to think again, dear boy," he said, James's colleague, as he waved his hands in the air loosely from side to side, then explained how our horse had, in fact, no chance of winning at all. A Billionaire Emirati Sheikh, shrouded in mystery, by the name of Ibn Rashid, had entered his undefeatable horse, Fusriya, into the race in a quick bid to elevate his prestige in London. Shaking his hips in time with the parading mule, the fellow described Fusriya's unfrayed string of recent victories, as well as his extravagant pampering regimen, his state-of-the-art stables, his coterie of world-class jockeys, and his devoted team of specialist equestrian staff. We were informed with certainty that Fusriya's physical prowess was unparalleled. Indeed, the stallion was named after the very concept of Arabian horsemanship that he so totally embodied. Rory and James were both visibly crestfallen, as this man continued to promote the fine qualities of the splendid horse. His final remark was that Fusriya's personal ketamine supply, valued at over £100,000, travelled with the exalted thoroughbred wherever he went, in case an emergency tranquilization needed to be administered. I saw Rory's disappointment transform into wanting curiosity, following the revelation of this crucial detail. His rather unsubtle line of questioning, focusing on the ketamine's security arrangement, was ignored by James's colleague, who went off to dance with his party of friends. The traveller's horse and band were all driven away coercively by the stewards on duty, as a thick cloud of terracotta-coloured dust began to form at the threshold of the car park, from whence emerged a far-stretching convoy of limousines and luxury speedsters, flanked on each side by armoured security vehicles. Everybody present was arrested in jubilant awe at the spectacularly extravagant arrival of 50 or so Emirati noblemen in formal dress stepping out of their cars. The grand entrance was punctuated by a final busload of migrant workers. A full staff had been brought by coach to serve Ibn Rashid's travelling party. The three of us, after polishing off the sherry and dutifully leaving the travel decanter in James's car, entered the racecourse itself, as fighting began to break out in the car park, drunkenly charging our way through the arteries of the Equitheatre. With all of the other misbehaving chaps, we found our allotted seats, and we made ourselves comfortable there. James had printed off our 3 tickets on his computer at the office. No one asked to see them at any point, of course. Such was the chaotic nature of the setting. Roughly 40 feet away was Ibn Rashid's shaded private section, where his men could be seen grinningly awaiting their arrogant victory in magnificent luxury, while Ibn Rashid himself remained composed. James took it upon himself to familiarise myself and Rory with the details of the race. A 1-mile course, flat for the first 2 furlongs, and then downhill, until the final uphill furlong. One of the most challenging stretches of track in British racing. The spectators drew silent as the pre-race procession of competing horses haphazardly commenced. Zulu Dostoevsky, jittery in form, was easily recognisable among the chain of parading horses for his grey speckled off-white coat and his silvery mane. Further along the line was Fusria, proud, mighty, and towering above the other horses. The glorious thoroughbred received abundant support from the stands, as the velvety chestnut stallion strutted past the adoring, sycophantic crowd with strong confirmation. The competing horses were gathered at the starting gate. By this stage, James and Rory's confidence in Zulu Dostoevsky was nothing more than an ironic affectation. A dozen or so horses came out bunched together and bumping into each other, not quite reaching a fast pace yet. On the second furlong, they began to spread out, making Zulu Dostoevsky clearly visible from our position. He was being checked by the horse ahead of him in 10th place or so. Fusria was prancing way out in front as the track began to slope downhill. Working tirelessly behind him, the leading pack was galloping fast, and Zulu Dostoevsky was comfortably among them. Just before the final furlong, Fusria was still way out in front, hard-ridden but going steady, with Zulu Dostoevsky only one horse behind him in third position. On the uphill gradient of the home straight, the overtaking horse in second place brought down Fusria, and Zulu Dostoevsky was in clear sight of victory, as the two leaders ahead came crashing into each other, falling to the ground. We watched with bated breath as Zulu Dostoevsky crossed the finish line in a walkover. The three of us erupted into a wild outburst of regrettably churlish celebration. Ibn Rashid's party was both devastated and enraged, but with a single gesture of his hand, the Sheikh was able to quell their tempestuous spirits, as he himself accepted the defeat with a quiet dignity. Rory and James remained ecstatic, as they invited me to join them in accepting the trophy with Zulu Dostoevsky and his jockey on the track. We absolutely covered each other in champagne, and we hoisted the trophy aloft, as Ibn Rashid looked on with a predatory curiosity. Overflowing with excitement, Rory was handed the commentator's microphone, and he verbalized a profound sense of gratitude. Then, quoting Shakespeare's Richard III, Rory declared, a horse, my kingdom for a horse," before everybody hurriedly made their way over to the drinks tent to get even more pissed. Beneath the crowded marquee, exaggerated descriptions of Fusria's injury were growing in both embellishment and colour among the gossip-thirsty spectators. After unanimously agreeing that we'd shown our faces sufficiently, following our victory, at Rory's suggestion, the three of us went off to smoke opium in the car park. Oblivious to the intense heat, as well as the passage of time. We sat resting against the concrete parking barrier in direct sunlight, waiting for the unexpected winnings to be verified on James's electronic bookmaker's app, and watching the exhausted migrant workers cleaning Ibn Rashid's vehicles. We passed around a very large and very fragrant opium cigarette, rolled as a team effort in Zulu Dostoevsky's honor. We saw Ibn Rashid, on his way out of the tent, break from his entourage to come and personally congratulate us on our win. He introduced himself and then informed us solemnly that Fusria had in fact suffered a minor injury, and in turn we expressed due grief before returning the introduction. Ibn Rashid then smiled, concealing a depth of emotion, and he complimented Rory on his fantastic Bedouin robes, which he absolutely couldn't get enough of. He was particularly impressed by Rory's authentic curved dagger, hanging conspicuously from his belt, the genuine article, Ibn Rashid said. The intoxicated Mr. Stewart did a little twirl, in order to fully exhibit his outfit's breathability, and in doing so, he fell onto the splintered plastic shards of a broken outdoor Pimm's jug discarded on the ground. Rory almost immediately got up as if nothing had happened at all. When the thoroughly impressed Sheikh asked him for an explanation as to why the fall hadn't hurt, Rory replied that it did hurt, but that the trick is not to care that it hurts. Rory, picking the pieces of plastic shrapnel from out of his palm, mentioned that he'd like very much to come and visit Fusri when he's recovered if possible. Ibn Rashid was really quite touched, and he invited all three of us to his English country house as his special guests for a game of polo on the next weekend. He insisted we come along, not taking no for an answer. As Ibn Rashid waited to hear our brain-dead collective response, the Sheikh pressed the butt of an imaginary shotgun against his shoulder and aimed towards the sky. Rory said we'd be delighted, as Ibn Rashid pretended to fire at a heron flying past, laughingly telling us that he'd only managed to hit its wing. After Ibn Rashid returned to his group, James, to Rory's embarrassment, told me that Rory, once upon a time, stole painkillers from a boy at school who had fallen off his horse playing polo, and that when he confessed, he was made to shovel dung for a term as punishment. James was paralysed with stupefying laughter for some time, failing to pick up on Rory's discomfort. The departure of Ibn Rashid and his entourage was as grand and spectacular as their arrival had been. With Fusria's carefully coordinated exit from the racecourse, monitored closely by Ibn Rashid at every stage, finally, the migrant workers, exhausted and weather-beaten, were forcefully packed into their bus as the extravagant convoy embarked on its homeward journey. As the dust blew in their wake, dirtying all three of us, Mr. Stewart's steely determination filled his lustful mad eyes. As the setting sun cast a scarlet hue from the horizon across the midsummer sky, the sloshed spectators all eventually made their way home. James drove us back to London in his four-wheel drive, with a rather slow off-the-ground Afghan folk recording playing through the car's integrated entertainment system at Rory's insistence. On the mid-morning of the Thursday, before our polo weekend, I agreed to meet Rory on Edgware Road. For several days, he had been desperate for me to help him pick out an appropriate gift for Ibn Rashid. After examining a great number of shop windows and perusing their selections with consideration, we came across the perfect gift for our host in an art dealer's front display. A to scale, on-canvas copy of Jean-Léon Gérôme's Rider and Dying Horse in the Desert, a striking landscape full of rugged poignancy. Each carrying opposite corners of the painting's frame, we headed for Rory's favourite hangout, an unsignposted cafe where his legendary backgammon tournament victory was memorialised by a youthful red-faced photograph hung on the wall. Rory told the boss-eyed waiter boy to bring over 2 bowls of rosewater ice cream. And then he revealed to me, confirming my suspicions, that on Saturday he plans to gain access to Ibn Rashid's stable unseen in order to funnel Fusria's highly prized supply of ketamine into James's horsebox through a length of hose. He spoke softly so as not to be overheard. Rory had 1 spoonful of ice cream and then nervously pushed his bowl towards me as a sort of offering. He was convinced resolutely that the plan was bound to succeed, so long as we believed so with certainty. To avoid probing, I scoffed the ice cream. Out of London's vast suburban sprawl, we broke out into the green, idyllic patchwork of countryside, and the roads drew narrower as we approached the relatively remote village. The cattle gate of Ibn Rashid's back entrance was swung open upon our arrival, and we parked in the jockey's driveway. Rory was obstinately commanding James to park no more than 25 metres from the stable, the length of Rory's hose. We psychologically readied ourselves for the heist as we got out of the car. Carrying the painting delicately, we circumvented the stable complex as instructed by the scorched-faced gatekeeper. We were greeted with tremendous warmth by Ibn Rashid, who was waiting for us on the lawn in a cricketer's jumper. Once again he made a point of admiring Mr. Stewart's Bedouin robes. Rory handed the painting to the hospitable sheikh, who marvelled at the piece with a bittersweet pain. He then informed us, with weighty solemnity, that polo had been cancelled. He was feeling uneasy about the prospect of using a horse other than Fusria during his unpredictable recovery. We lamented and offered kind, reassuring words. As the first guests began to pour in, we were invited on a personal tour of Ibn Rashid's grounds. In fact, he practically forced us into his golf buggy. We were taken to the pool enclosure, fastidiously swept each day by the staff. The enclosure was, apparently, inspired by the life and work of David Hockney. Then we were taken to the rose garden, dead-headed vigilantly every evening at dusk. The garden's fragrance delighted all who passed its surrounding Saxon-era stone wall. Next on the tour we saw the tennis court. Bitumened meticulously once a month, the court was measured according to precise Olympic specifications. On the way to the tour's final destination, the stables, Ibn Rashid told us in passing that at great expense he had converted a few dozen acres of field into a desert, covered with imported Emirati sand 7 meters deep. The equestrian facility was vast, and a full staff of horse-minders rushed assiduously from stall to stall, not one empty-handed. Fusria's stable was the biggest, and by far the most palatial. Within its hushed chambers, the injured steed was being nursed back to health by a focused team of doctors, and a veterinary physiotherapist was stretching the affected hoof in a controlled fashion. It was clear that Fusriya's pain was felt acutely by Ibn Rashid, as he underwent a series of medical interventions. Meanwhile, I noticed Rory paying close attention to an equine vet who entered from a door marked private, wielding a syringe needle that he then injected into Fusriya's rump. As we made our way out of the stable, Rory feigned surprise that his dagger was missing from his belt, somewhere beneath the straw bedding. He needed to find the bladed curio at once. I was able to distract everybody with a series of frivolous, yet suitably engaging questions directed towards the vets, while Rory crept into the secret room in order to siphon off the liquid ketamine, with a length of hose he had hidden up his robes, into James's horse box, parked just behind the open door. Rory eventually returned to tell us that he'd found his dagger, pleasing Ibn Rashid, who then invited us to enjoy the grounds at our own leisure. James, desperately keen for a swim, made a hasty dash for the pool enclosure. Rory and I managed to sneak over to James's car behind the stables, and we were presented with quite the conundrum. Liquid ketamine was spurting out onto the grass in large amounts from a small hole on the exterior of the horse box. In an atmosphere of great urgency, Rory ordered me to go and find something with which to plug up the leak, whilst he decisively used his sticking-out tongue to block any further spillage. I scrambled to find something in the way of a discarded plastic bag, but Ibn Rashid's grounds were kept in such pristine condition that I seemed unable to find a single thing worthy. I reached the tennis courts, and was ultimately able to get my hands on some grip tape used to rebind the players' racket handles. Sprinting back, tape in hand, I returned to see a puzzled-looking James, who'd just gone back to his car to fetch his swimming trunks. Now standing above a chemically paralysed Rory Stewart, as gushing liquid ketamine both soaked his Bedouin robes and crystallised ephemerally on his pale, expressionless face. I patched up the leak, but as I stepped back, I noticed that the hose was being manually recoiled from the stable end. We hastily grabbed Rory and attempted to camouflage ourselves behind a thick bush in total silence. I suggested we leave right then, but James revealed that his work phone was charging on a table in the pool enclosure. He pleaded the case for its invaluability pitifully. We remained perfectly still, as a pair of horse-minders poked their heads around the car park with a rather doltish lack of suspicion. James gave Rory a bit of cocaine, shushing him as he sniffed, and our wayward prince began to exhibit primordial signs of life. The coast was now clear. We loaded the disoriented Mr. Stewart into the boot of James's car and returned to the party as if nothing unusual had happened at all. Ibn Rashid was incredibly disappointed to hear, upon our return, that Rory was feeling unwell and therefore resting in the car. Because he was very busy greeting his guests, Ibn Rashid suggested we might like to join the other arrivals, who were enjoying the glorious summer's day by the pool. Ibn Rashid's 20-something-year-old relatives were cavorting in the shallow end, and guzzling down cocktails as they reconnected with one another socially. James was fixated on repetitively swimming laps, electronically charting his progress on his smartwatch as he went. Without a set of trunks, I perched on the side of the pool on a director's chair, fully dressed, as I was granted intimate access to the scandalous world of London's Emirati gossip mill. For a long time, Ibn Rashid's look-alike nephew, Hamad, was in the crosshairs of his female relatives, who softly interrogated him, in a sort of jokey way, about his playboy lifestyle in the West End. From his floating lilo, the carpet-chested lad managed to tactfully draw attention away from his notorious indiscretions by offering everybody some of his top-quality cocaine, which he ordered me to fetch from his trousers. I was the only dry person present. As I blindly rummaged through his pockets in search of the libertine nephew's stash, Ibn Rashid's butler came up to the gate of the pool enclosure to gather everybody in the pavilion. After an exquisite lunch, the staff cleared the table. Ibn Rashid announced with glee his intention to play polo as previously arranged. He toasted Rory in his absence and confessed that for the last week or so he had been inspired by Rory's infectious, mind-over-matter approach to life. And he expressed unfettered gratitude. The game was to be played in Fusriya's honour. James announced that he mustn't join in after so many beers. Then, looking at me, he knowingly gestured towards his nostril. The game was to be played in Fusriya's honour. All of the guests gathered on sun chairs on the lawn to watch Ibn Rashid and 3 of his star players against his cousin Abdulaziz and 3 of his star players. Everybody was in formidable spirits during the match. Supporting no team in particular, we all cheered. Then suddenly, climbing over the stone wall of Ibn Rashid's fake desert, a zombified Mr. Stewart emerged. Frightening the horses, Rory galloped around the polo field, whinnying and flailing his arms frantically like a madman. His bewildered face, his matted hair, and his torn robes were covered in imported Emirati sand as he charged aimlessly across the pitch. After approximately 10 seconds, he was walloped on the head with force by a swinging mallet before tumbling straight down to the grass from the impact. Every player dismounted his horse in shock. The spectators ran onto the pitch aghast, and the first aid team at hand rushed to Rory's side. Rory was taken to recover on a wicker lounger, where the other guests crowded around him. As everybody fawned hysterically over Rory, one of Fusriya's veterinary team hurried over and whispered timidly in Ibn Rashid's ear.
He was visibly alarmed by the message, and he followed the vet to discuss the matter in depth. James was trying to wake up Rory, shaking his limp body. He thought we should leave immediately, before we're discovered. I must say that I totally agreed. Then everybody looked up suddenly. Ibn Rashid stormed back in a furious rage, declaring emphatically that Fusriya has been forced to suffer agonizing pain because somebody has stolen his ketamine supply in its entirety. He instinctively accused his nephew Hamad of stealing it, revealing in the process his awareness of the young man's debauched private lifestyle. With wounded pride, the chap asserted his innocence staunchly and repeatedly, until erupting into an explosive tantrum. Hamad, abandoned by even his close companions, stormed off in a huff. Wiping his stern face with an opal-coloured handkerchief, Ibn Rashid swiftly composed himself, and then asked for James and I to join him inside the house. James was permitted to enter the foyer of the magnificent Alcazar, even in his trunks, owing to the importance of the matter at hand. The enormous house was opulent yet understated in design, contrasting austere Edwardian subtlety with bespoke Ottoman splendour. The two of us were escorted to Ibn Rashid's Thames View office, and gazing out of the casement window, he insisted forthrightly that I must kill his nephew Hamad in order to prevent an escalating intra-tribal feud. James accepted on my behalf without hesitation. Having spent time in Dubai during the early 2000s, he knew well how they dealt with thieves, and he thought it was best for us not to stand accused. Ibn Rashid ordered his men to find his nephew and bring him to the firing range. Ibn Rashid drove the three of us deep into his private artificial desert in a sand buggy. Rory was passed out in the back seat beside James. Ibn Rashid was adamant that Mr. Stewart should come along as a steadfast and just man of honour, even at rest. We arrived at a colossal igneous rock, imported from the UAE, which Ibn Rashid euphemistically referred to as his firing range, as he handed me a 45 M1911 Colt pistol, once fired by Peter O'Toole, that he'd picked up at an auction. Following his instructions, I got out of the car by myself, and apprehensively I circumvented the monolith, to find Hamad, the nephew, beaten to a bloody pulp around the corner, guarded by two heavies, with his hands fastened behind his head as he baked in the sun. As Ibn Rashid had ordered me to do, I raised the gun, pointing it at Hamad as he wept. I closed my eyes, and blocking out any thought at all, I blasted the pistol, seemingly killing him in the blink of an eye. Feeling withdrawn, I turned back and walked away. as the two heavies dragged him off to be buried in the sand. I was shocked at my own actions. I got back in the front seat and everybody cheered me for what I had done. James called me a fantastic chap as we made our way back through the desert, and Ibn Rashid thanked me for maintaining the unity of his noble tribe. As Ibn Rashid received the audio message from the two heavies that the task was complete, I felt macabre shock surrender itself to animalistic bloodlust. Somewhere deep in my psyche, feeling an overwhelming compulsion to shoot someone again, to take another life right then, I pointed the pistol at Ibn Rashid, aiming for his face. But there were no more bullets left in the chamber of the gun. In the silent tension to follow, for some reason my attention was drawn to James's stunned expression, reflected in the rear-view mirror. Ibn Rashid began trying to wrestle the gun from my grip, threatening to kill me with his bare hands as he tugged against the pistol in a furious eruption. The frenzied pleading for calm did little to de-escalate the situation. He was set to overpower me, until quick as a flash, Rory, rising from his deep slumber, lunged forward and sliced open Ibn Rashid's throat with one swift motion of his pearl-encrusted dagger. As crimson, gushing blood came forth from the Sheikh's artery, he stared into my eyes with a ferocious intensity, only releasing hold of the gun as his strength dwindled and his life force slowly vanished from his body. I'll never forget that fleeting, agonized expression on Ibn Rashid's face as he drew his final breath. We composed ourselves and removed the nervous energy from the sand buggy with a series of light-hearted understatements to ironically deconstruct our present situation. The three of us were drenched in blood, and the windscreens were completely obscured in a most gory fashion. Bickering like imbecilic schoolboys as reality kicked in, we started blaming one another for the mess and bandying about responsibility. Then, all of a sudden, Ibn Rashid's phone began to ring. We paused uncertainly. I wiped the blood from the electronic touch screen in front of me on the dashboard and used it to answer the ringing phone remotely. It was Hamad, Ibn Rashid's nephew, who'd somehow survived the execution and was now half buried in the sand. With his voice incredibly strained, he begged for forgiveness and to be given a second chance to clean up his act. Rory, with his finger extended, reached forward to delicately press the end call icon on the screen, and with confidence he laid out our plan going forth. Rory noticed that Ibn Rashid and Hamad shared a striking family resemblance. In fact, he had mistaken the two earlier in the day. Rory maintained that his vision had remained intact during his state of dissociation. So his suggestion was that we simply switch Ibn Rashid's dead body with his living nephew, who would then pose as Ibn Rashid upon our return to the house, where we were to tell everybody that Hamad had been chopped up in the interior of the sand buggy. and if he refused to participate in the charade, we threatened to shoot him with the gun. He had no reason to know about the absence of bullets within its chambers. Rory clambered into the front seat, pushing Ibn Rashid's corpse to one side, and wiping clear a small viewing window for himself on the bloody windscreen. He reassured us that everything was going to be fine, so long as we sincerely believed in our version of reality. Rory drove us back to Hamad's burial site, behind the distinctive igneous rock, now clear of onlooking heavies. We saw the poor chap, half covered in sand, with tied up wrists, unable to nurse his bullet wounds in the dry heat of the alfresco slaughterhouse. Flinging open his door, Rory marched over to the fellow, waving the unloaded gun with purpose, screeching unintelligible threats at the chap as he approached in his blood-stained robes. His snarling face, covered in blood, sand, and crystallized ketamine, must have been a most terrifying sight. Hamad screamed, panicking, as he pleaded to be spared. But Mr. Stewart totally subdued the quivering lad by digging his knee hard into the restrained chap's neck and pressing the gun against his temple. Rory ordered James and I to drag the corpse over and remove the polo silks, saturated in blood, from his stiffening body. After we completed the gruesome task, Rory unbound Hamad's wrists and forced him at gunpoint to put on the clothes, now heavy with wet, scarlet sand and reeking from the putrid stench of death. Absolutely terrified, the chap obediently got dressed, retching and gagging as he put on his uncle's foul silks. The pistol, though empty of bullets, served as a very effective tool for enforcing our will. Rory explained to the nephew, with an uncharacteristic air of menace, that he must pose as Ibn Rashid from now on. Hamad, almost an exact spitting image of his uncle, agreed to comply. Then he asked if any of us had a small amount of drugs that he could take in order to handle the stress of the situation more cogently. After burying Ibn Rashid's body in place of his nephew's, all four of us climbed onto the top of the distinctive monolith to take stock of our supplies. James's packet of cocaine had been dissolved in his trunks while he was swimming. Rory's piece of opium, encased in a scrap of foil, was congealed with blood, incapable of being purified. And so we scraped the clear patches of crystallized ketamine from his skin and sniffed that. With an equine tranquility, we admired the panoramic view of the expansive desert. giving Hamad time to embody the role of Ibn Rashid, whom he had been mimicking with his cousins for many years. Then we scaled down the rock into the sand buggy. As we entered the hot, fetid vehicle, Hamad told us not to worry, because everybody was so afraid of Ibn Rashid that there was no chance whatsoever of a confrontation upon our return. I reminded Hamad, as we headed back to the party, that he must remember to appear forlorn on account of Fusriya's continued suffering. He expressed genuine appreciation for the advice. Parked behind the great house, and Hamad, impersonating Ibn Rashid very convincingly, instructed an attendant to place 4 pristine outfits on the bed. We greeted the butler, who was none the wiser, as we tracked blood and sand through the house and up the stairs. We took turns using Ibn Rashid's ensuite shower, and while we waited, Hamad told us a bit about his uncle's life, his upbringing, his particular role within the family. The 5 years he spent as a mixologist in Sharm el-Sheikh were described fondly by the emotionally conflicted nephew. Dressed in pure white, full-length Emirati tunics belonging to Ibn Rashid, the 4 of us came downstairs to face the expectant guests, who were to be found revelling by the pool. We were welcomed with a congratulatory uproar. From floating lilos, reclining loungers, and folded-out canvas chairs, they cheered for us in luxurious celebration as a great feast of strawberries was carried into the enclosure by servants. In a pointed display of dramatic irony, many of his relatives rushed to Hamad, posing in disguise as Ibn Rashid, to whisper in his ear how much they've always despised him. Then he announced to his crowded guests that Fusriya's suffering has been duly accounted for, his nephew's grisly killing balancing the scales of justice, and settling any vengeful feuding on the matter henceforth. In the starry glow of that midsummer night, the secluded poolside festivities reached unequalled levels of ostentatious debauchery. Had any of the drunken revellers been paying any attention whatsoever, it would have been clear that the normally chaste Ibn Rashid was behaving uncharacteristically rambunctiously, thus revealing his true identity. But everybody was so totally absorbed in the gyrating frenzy that his performance played out unquestioned. Rory was mentally faded from the ketamine earlier, and from guzzling unattended cocktails. I think he may still have been concussed too. Mr. Stewart was rather conveniently unable to move his own face, and was therefore incapable of revealing any element of our convoluted plot. Everything was going according to plan. Hamad, immersed in his new identity as Ibn Rashid, summoned me over to come and be hand-fed strawberries by his gorgeously tempting, bikini-clad relatives, who'd set up a station on a table for dusting the exquisite fruit in a layer of powdered Captagon. But then James pulled me away and notified me that a rumour was circulating that we had stolen the ketamine and framed Hamad. At once we set out to locate Rory. He was spread out limp across 2 loungers. I picked up his feet and James grabbed his body. As we attempted to carry him out of the carnivalesque enclosure, a group of dancing men commanded us to throw Rory into the pool. So we tossed him into the water so as to avoid suspicion. As anyone could have predicted in hindsight, Rory sank like a stone to the bottom of the deep end. James dived in heroically to save Rory, who let out an extremely off-putting, spluttering gasp as he was rescued to surface. Rory remained unconscious as we carried the soaking wet fellow across the sparsely lit grounds. We got him into the car before decompressing in our seats, savouring the rewards of a well-choreographed getaway. James and I celebrated in the car before heading off. Later, on a country road out of Ibn Rashid's village, the battery signal alerted James to the fact that Rory had left the car running all day, exhausting the vehicle's electricity supply. The roadside mechanic service's telephone operator told James we'd have to wait potentially for as long as 2 hours until one of their fleet becomes available. Rory, still sopping wet, woke up and asked to be filled in as to what was happening, and so I explained that we're waiting 2 hours for a roadside mechanic. I suspected that he had no comprehension whatsoever of what he'd been told. A provincial boy racer came to a halt beside us, rolled down his tinted window, and Rory told him that we're waiting 2 hours for a roadside mechanic with a horse box full of liquid ketamine. The young lad told us he'd be back shortly, with a big thermos of tea. A large, unmarked white van pulled over next to us, and half a dozen or so threatening oiks got out. Wielding makeshift agricultural weapons, they made every effort to intimidate us into handing over the horse box. Rory got out of the car, swinging the door open, and waving his dagger, he fell to the ground. The oiks howled with cruel excitement, kicking Rory down in the mud. I was perfectly happy to hand over the ketamine peacefully. However, meaningless violence reigned supreme. Savagely dragging us out of the car, they agonizingly thrashed myself and James with bicycle chains until we hadn't the strength to even carry ourselves. Then they dumped all three of us into the thorny roadside hedgerow, where an additional beating was administered as we dangled from the branches. Through my swollen, throbbing eye, I was just able to spot them, burning James's car with petrol in a great hoot of laughter, and then driving off with the coveted horsebox securely attached to the back of their van.